Welcome back, everybody. We all know which games and series have been successful through the years. When you look at your favorite series, ask yourself, have the developers made significant changes to the games along the way? If merely replicating success is fine, then for how long? How many times can developers afford to do that before the player base will want to move on or start to demand changes? Suppose that changes or additions are always necessary, then what do those look like? Although it seems like there are only two options available, with innovation and replication being suggested, there's one more option that I'll refer to as false innovation. Something like how in Pokémon, Game Freak have implemented battle mechanics in subsequent generations, Z-moves, Gigantamax, and now Terra types. Yet these mechanics are removed in favor of something new for the next game. These mechanics are examples of false innovation because they don't change the foundational gameplay in which the series is built upon. In fact, you can play more than 99% of these games without having to engage with these mechanics. So, Z-moves, Gigantamax, and Terra types, they're present and they're new, but it's more appropriate to view them as bells and whistles instead of examples of true innovation. Movement is an integral mechanic of virtually every video game. You might not think of it as anything crucial in the Pokémon games, but let's quickly review a few examples to see if and how Game Freak innovated on it. X and Y on the 3DS finally introduced 8-directional movement. Additionally, there were rollerblades that allowed you to move in 360 degrees in most areas. Sun and Moon continued with 360 degrees of movement in all areas of the games, and while it was a pleasant change, the games largely played and felt the same. It wasn't until Sword and Shield, with their sprawling wild areas and a free camera in particular, that how you traverse the world of Pokémon started to feel different. We all experienced very similar games between Generation 1 and Generation 5, or between Red and Blue and Black and White. Yes, as technology advanced, we were fortunate to receive things like day and night cycles, changing seasons, more ways to evolve Pokémon, more involved stories, new types, and the physical and special split. But how much did the foundation of the series actually change? I would argue, not much. I believe that Game Freak has, for the most part, been replicating their successes throughout the generations. Certainly, all of the aforementioned small changes and quality of life improvements can make playing a new game exciting, but think of this. What are Game Freak's biggest selling points for any upcoming Pokémon game? The new region and its new Pokémon. Not a new catching system, and certainly not a new battle system. As the saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Pokémon Legends Arceus is one of the best games in the series in my opinion, and yes, I realize that it's technically a spin-off. It feels like a familiar Pokémon game, but there are so many differences in the catching and exploration mechanics. It's a breath of fresh air while still serving delight to old fans of the series, and to me, it's a sure example of innovation. Since beating it, I've moved on to Pokémon Scarlet. I was curious about what Game Freak would take from Arceus and apply to Scarlet, and while you'll have to wait for my Pokémon ranking video to hear more of my opinions on the game, I will say that Scarlet at least feels like the next step forward in Pokémon. Now, I'd like to present some sales charts for the mainline Pokémon games. My idea going into this video was that I would examine a few different long-running series by analyzing their sales figures as well as their player demographics for the games. I had hoped that with my knowledge of the games and knowing which ones were innovative, I would be able to identify spikes in sales that corresponded with innovation. I wanted to analyze demographics as well because it would be interesting to see, for example, correlation between an aging player base and the gradual decline in popularity of a series, especially one that lacked innovation. This first chart shows the bulk of the games clustered by generation. Remakes are not included. Right off the bat, the popularity of Generation 1 is tremendous. One thing that I cannot tell you is how many of these sales are from the time around the game's initial releases, and how many are from the rest of the game's lifespans. Almost every generation after 1 maintained consistent popularity. Generation 6, or the X and Y series more specifically, is the only outlier with approximately 2/3 of the average sales per generation. What happened here? X and Y were the first Pokémon games on the 3DS, which should have generated plenty of excitement. Generation 6 also had Mega Evolutions, including some for the Kanto starters, so there was an element of nostalgia as a selling point. Was the existing Pokémon fanbase simply getting too old and losing interest in their childhood series? Maybe some fans were simply holding out for Pokémon Z or X2 and Y2 expansions, which obviously never came. This next chart compares the aforementioned expansions, as I've dubbed them, Yellow, Crystal, Emerald, etc. Since X and Y didn't have an expansion game, I thought that it would be interesting to see how its immediate follow-up, Sun and Moon, sold as well. Once again, you'll notice right off the bat that Generation 1, or Pokémon Yellow, sold incredibly well. Why such a large drop exists between its sales and those of Pokémon Crystal is a bit of a mystery to me. It's safe to say that Game Freak innovated significantly while working with the Game Boy Color's hardware. You can tell that the games were improved upon simply by looking at screenshots and seeing more colors in the environments. Beyond that, Game Freak implemented sprite animations, a day and night system, breeding, and shiny Pokemon, just to name a few things. I suspect that what happened is that most parents simply couldn't afford or didn't want to buy their kids another Pokemon game for the same hardware. I say the same hardware because in North America, Generation 1 and the Game Boy Color released only 1 month apart. Many kids, like myself, probably received a Game Boy Color as their first Nintendo handheld and skipped the original Game Boy entirely. Notice how the expansions continue to sell more copies as the generations progressed. It appears as if people caught on to Game Freak's tendency to make a third game for every generation prior to X and Y. At first I thought that Sun and Moon sales were relatively high because fans did not anticipate an expansion coming after X and Y bucked that trend, and that the reason why Sun and Moon still sold less than X and Y was because X and Y were generally underwhelming. However, we see that the Ultra expansions actually sold better than all of the other expansions, barring Yellow. So what exactly was happening here? Look back at the first chart that lumps all of a generation's main games together. Earlier, I pointed out the consistency of the Pokémon series. If fans did disappear with X and Y, then why did they return for the following games? I don't think that the Sun and Moon series were particularly innovative, even if they did dispense with the traditional gym challenge. Enter Pokémon Go. Remember that mobile game that you probably downloaded but only played for a couple of weeks? I won't get into sales and demographic statistics for that game, but it was and still is undeniably popular. It was released several months earlier in the same year as Sun and Moon, so even if it wasn't a part of the mainline games, it rekindled interest in the series and provided extraordinary marketing for Sun and Moon. Something that I at least find interesting in this final chart is that subsequent version releases on the same console never sold as well as the first releases. I mean that Black and White did not sell as well as Diamond and Pearl. Sun and Moon did not sell as well as X and Y. Scarlet and Violet have not sold as well as Sword and Shield, but at the rate in which Scarlet and Violet are selling, they should certainly pass Sword and Shield. If that happens, will it be due to their innovations, or will it be because of better marketing and advertising, which the games certainly received? There are so many things to consider when determining why a particular game sold so well in any given series. I want to isolate and concentrate on this question of innovation versus replication, but it's hard to separate either of those factors from everything else involved. Like I just mentioned, marketing and advertising play huge roles in a game's success, at least for sales numbers at launch. Another thing that we'll examine briefly is the popularity of the hardware in which the game is released on. When revisiting this first chart and seeing the shortcomings of X and Y, you might conclude that their relative lack of success isn't due to gameplay, advertising, or hardware, but to something as simple as there not being another version to follow up the tandem. You would then compare X and Y's sales to Sword and Shield sales, which also did not have a follow-up version. What Sword and Shield did have, however, was DLC. I don't know how much DLC contributes to overall sales. It's not something that I'm looking at in detail. My point is to draw attention to yet another non-innovation and non-replication factor that potentially influences sales. Let's wrap up this section on Pokemon by looking at Nintendo's consoles. How much did the popularity of specific consoles affect the sales of their particular games? What you see here are the figures for the lifetime sales for the consoles in blue and the lifetime sales for their respective games in red. The Nintendo GBA offered 3 Pokemon entries between 2002 and 2004, Ruby and Sapphire, Emerald, and Fire Red and Leaf Green. The GBA's sales are commendable, but the Pokemon games themselves were clearly not household items for all GBA owners. The same could be said for the Nintendo DS. While it is the most popular console by a landslide, its Pokemon game sales aren't nearly as robust. Yes, more Pokemon games sold on the DS compared to the GBA or the 3DS, but one would expect even more units sold given the console's popularity. Between 2006 and 2008, the DS offered Diamond and Pearl, Platinum, Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Black and White, and Black 2 and White 2. Looking at the 3DS figures, you have to wonder if it was exclusively a Pokemon machine for many owners. That much was basically true for me. Between 2013 and 2017, 3DS owners were treated to X and Y, Pokemon Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow via Virtual Console, Sun and Moon, and Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. Finally, the Switch. Will its hardware sales catch up to those of the DS? We'll find out in due time. One thing that's for certain is that Pokemon's popularity has exploded on the console. Since 2018, the Switch has offered Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, Sword and Shield, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, Legends Arceus, and Scarlet and Violet. Even if I were to subtract the sales of Let's Go and Arceus for you purists, which total approximately 30 million, the games on the Switch would still be outselling those on the DS, albeit by a small margin. So, what does it all mean? For one thing, Pokemon continues to grow in popularity. I think that any concerns and stagnation have been quelled by the immense success of Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet on the Switch. Nintendo has been slow to adopt modern mechanics in their Pokemon games, but we're finally seeing them with open worlds, new camera controls, and some experimentation in the storytelling. Again, I would argue that much of Pokemon's success over the decades is due to Game Freak replicating addictive gameplay systems that have been in place since the early years. How much of the recent success is due to innovation? And how much innovation have we truly seen in recent years? I'd be interested in hearing your opinions on the topic in the comments. We can now move on to our next long-running series. Here is a rough representation of Final Fantasy game sales. There are a few too many caveats to mention with these figures, but I will point out that certain compilations like Dawn of Souls are excluded here. Also, I don't know what it is about Final Fantasy XIV, but virtually every site reports on the number of players in a different way. This number, 24 million, was presented on the Video Game Sales Wiki. I interpret it as the number of unique users with active subscriptions. Some sites report total players around 50 million, which I believe includes inactive accounts. Regardless of the scenario, the number is staggering. We can see that innovation and persistence in the continued development of their MMO title has paid off. Final Fantasy XIV is Square Enix's most profitable and popular Final Fantasy game by far. Did you notice anything unusual in the first few columns of the chart? Wouldn't you expect Final Fantasy IV and VI to have far more sales with their overseas releases? There are a couple of things that I should mention. The first is that Final Fantasy IV only sold 340,000 units outside of Japan on the SNES. VI fared considerably better, selling almost 900,000 outside of Japan on the SNES. Second, Final Fantasy IV The After Years is roughly on par in total sales with its prequel, although its numbers are not represented in the graph. If you took those into account, then 4 would have over 10 million units sold. It's difficult to make any accurate assessment about the early games, 1 through 6, in the series. The games have been remade and re-released countless times, including on mobile and PC devices. Final Fantasy III saw tremendous success on the Nintendo DS with over 2 million units sold. For comparison, 4's release on the DS only netted 1.1 million units sold. Knowing what we know, with the vast majority of people preferring some of the other early entries to 3, what can be attributed to 3's success? Is innovation to thank? Final Fantasy III introduced a job system that got better the more that you played the game. Rather than having assigned classes from the beginning or set classes for unique characters, 3's job system allowed you to change what each character specialized in at any point during your playthrough. Not only were all of the new vocations, spells, and abilities fun to experiment with, but they allowed for more varied gameplay and helped to create even more individualized experiences for the players. Final Fantasy IV reverted to set classes for its characters, as was previously seen in Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy V returned to the Myriad job system in 3, but you can see that 5's sales fall below 4's. This is where the different releases need to be untangled. Here is a chart showcasing the first 6 Final Fantasy games and their original versions released on original hardware. The red line represents the units sold in Japan. The yellow line represents the units sold overseas. The total sales are indicated by the blue columns. First, you can see the outstanding success of Final Fantasy I. The surprising thing to note here is that the overseas sales were greater than those in Japan. In fact, the overseas sales, totaling 780,000, rival Final Fantasy II's on their own. If we set Final Fantasy I aside and focus on the remaining 5 games, we notice that there was steady growth in the series in Japan. Perhaps Final Fantasy IV should have sold more copies. Was the limited growth in sales due to the series reverting to set classes for the playable characters? Did gamers in Japan not have their hands on Super Famicoms just yet? Maybe, by the time that the next consoles were purchased, gamers jumped back into the series with Final Fantasy V. As I've alluded to, I don't think of Final Fantasy IV as innovative. While it's certainly not a bad game, I've always considered it overrated. There were good characters and the story was an improvement over 3's, but I didn't care for the class restrictions. Maybe gamers in the early 90s felt the same way. If we continue following the sales trends for Japan, we can see that the exact same scenario occurs between Final Fantasy V and 6. 5 plays almost identically to 3, and it's lauded for its job system and the ability to customize your party exactly to your tastes. Final Fantasy VI plays almost identically to 4. Maybe the similarities in gameplay are responsible for the similarities in the sales patterns. Taking overseas sales into account paints a totally different picture of the series. Localization aside, worldwide sales indicate that the series has been progressing remarkably, garnering more popularity with every subsequent release. Let's return to our macroscopic view of the Final Fantasy series. Everyone is aware of the global phenomenon that was Final Fantasy VII. Square marketed their game spectacularly and delivered a product that was brimming with change. Everything from the graphics to the story had been dialed up to 11, and the result was a game that played similarly enough to the rest of the series, but had the player embark on an adventure that was grander than ever. Maybe the drop-off in the popularity of the subsequent games was to be expected, simply because 7 set the bar astronomically high. That said, Final Fantasy VIII sold admirably. 8 is one of the more unusual games in the series due to its dreamlike world and unorthodox gameplay. I feel like it rode the success of Final Fantasy VII, but ultimately alienated some of the fan base by virtue of it being so different. If that was the case, then it would explain the significantly reduced sales for Final Fantasy IX, and I really mean significant. Final Fantasy VIII sold 8.6 million copies on the PlayStation 1. Final Fantasy IX sold 5.5 million copies. Or, perhaps the issue that faced 9 was the change in tone. 9 abandoned much of the realism that the previous games had been building toward in favor of a world full of idiosyncratic characters. The characters in 9 look like they're conjured from the imagination of Dr. Seuss, and they all have quirky personalities like the cast of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. I'm not sure whether the blame for the declined success of Final Fantasy on the back end of the PS1 lies with Final Fantasy VIII or 9, but it's clear that too much change was a bad thing. Square, to their credit, continued to innovate after 7, but it simply wasn't what the audience wanted. Moving on to the PlayStation 2. Are you surprised to see the immense success of Final Fantasy X? On its own, the game sold around 8.5 million copies, which essentially brought the series back to the success it experienced at the time of Final Fantasy VIII. The remaining 6 million units represented in the graph are thanks to 10 10-2 collections. If you include 10-2's individual sales, then the total number for the duology becomes a staggering 21.1 million units. Who knew that a love story and excessive fan service would sell so well? This exclusive club of 20 million or more combined sales is shared only by Final Fantasy VII and Reborn, 14, which we discussed, and believe it or not, the 13 trilogy. Forgive me for being brief, but the can of worms that is Final Fantasy XIII will have to be revisited another day. In summary, Lightning Returns, or the game that tried to be the most different in the trilogy, was the one that sold the worst. It was different for all the wrong reasons. I'll quickly give credit to Final Fantasy XII for recovering after its underwhelming PS2 versions. The Zodiac Age and multi-platform releases helped it become what you see in the chart, and I think that fans now appreciate 12's similarities to 10 and the quasi-MMO feeling of the game. Final Fantasy XV, despite all of its apparent risks and featuring a leather-clad assembly of emo pop stars, actually performed respectably in the market. For Square Enix, 10 million units sold is probably a disappointment. I suspect that many people were turned off by how different the game looked, and by this point in the series, many of the older fans wanted nothing to do with action-based gameplay. Finally, we have this poor, pathetic bar on the far right of the graph. Look at that, a whopping 3 million units sold for the latest entry in one of the most revered and renowned video game franchises in the world. Do you know why Final Fantasy XVI sold so poorly? Not because of innovation or lack thereof. Not because the game only features one playable character. The game flopped because it's a PS5 exclusive. Okay, I'm being facetious, but I'm sure that it being an exclusive drastically hurt its sales. I can't comment on innovation because I haven't played the game, and I only heard about the one playable character thing. Whatever the reasons are, the result is the same. Bad. We just looked at the most recent mainline Pokemon games topping 20 million units sold. Final Fantasy hasn't had a mainline game sell this little since 5 was released. 3 million units sold is atrocious for such a historic franchise. And yet, I find it hard to care, knowing that Square Enix puts most of their attention towards the 7 remakes. The last long-running series to be featured today is my personal favorite, The Legend of Zelda. Let's begin with a simplified chart. I decided to strip away all Zelda titles available on handheld, a lesser title than Four Swords Adventure, and all remakes and remasters. What we are left with ought to be the most popular and most recognized games in the series. The first thing that struck me as I was compiling this data was how strong the series was in its debut. The first 2 Zeldas are the 6th and 8th best-selling games on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Once again, as is the case with the other 2 franchises that we looked at, the second game in the series immediately drops off in sales. I'm not going to spend time investigating that curious trend for this video, but it is an oddity worth noting. I can only guess that it has to do with video game fatigue, tight budgets, or differences in advertising. A Link to the Past fared slightly better than its predecessor, with 4.6 million sales, earning it the honor of 7th best-selling game on the Super Nintendo. This is a bigger achievement than it appears, considering the fact that the NES and Famicom consoles outsold the SNES and Super Famicom consoles by over 12 million units. A Link to the Past was made in the same style as the first Zelda, but significantly improved every aspect of the game. I'm uncertain whether or not this return to the original gameplay was a relief to the fanbase after the dramatic shift to something different in Zelda 2. Nintendo must have been satisfied with their creation, because this became the template for all subsequent 2D Zelda games. Ocarina of Time is when the series exploded. Again, this is made even more impressive when you take the Nintendo 64's paltry hardware sales into account. The console was dwarfed by the PlayStation 1's 102 million units and only managed to sell 33 million units. Much of Ocarina of Time's success can be attributed to the advent of Nintendo's 3D graphics with their new console. That isn't to downplay the innovation present in Ocarina of Time, as we saw many unspectacular games on the Nintendo 64 that didn't make good use of the hardware. Ocarina of Time was a beautiful and ambitious game and very well executed. The tools and equipment at Link's disposal make it one of the most fun Zelda games to play to this day. The thematic dungeons and exuberant characters make it one of the most memorable games in the series. If you want a shining example of innovation in a long-running series, this is it. While I am partial to Majora's Mask, it lacked innovation and perhaps suffered in sales because of it. Maybe it was afflicted by the same sequel sickness that characterized the Pokémon expansions. It's possible that fans didn't take a chance on Majora's Mask because it didn't look to offer enough of a different experience. I say, their loss. Nintendo's meager console sales continued with the GameCube. If you thought that the gap in competition between the Nintendo 64 and the PS1 was bad, then this next one will be horrendous. The PlayStation 2, largely due to being a jailbreaker's dream, outsold the GameCube by a total of 158 million units to 21.7 million units. On top of the GameCube being a hard sell, Wind Waker surprised some older fans for the worst by having childish, cel-shaded graphics. Their words, not mine. Those fans wanted grit, maturity, and darkness in their next Zelda game. Where was the Hero of Time or a similarly striking Link? Well, those that played Wind Waker loved the game, and thankfully, Nintendo didn't abandon cel-shaded Zelda games for good. The next 2 Zelda titles, Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, offered little to nothing in the way of innovation, and both the presentations of the games as well as their sales mirrored Ocarina of Time and Wind Waker. Twilight Princess was the darker game that Zelda fans had been asking for, while Skyward Sword was supposedly the game that the developers had been eager to make. You can tell, based on the numbers, that catering to the audience proved more successful. But for 101 million Wii consoles sold, you would expect more out of a series as iconic as Zelda. How could this fabled franchise fall to less than 1 out of every 10 console owners having a Zelda game in their collection? Stagnation is the answer. The series played virtually the same way in 2011 as it did in 1998. Something had to change. Breath of the Wild, the epitome of innovation. Somehow, someway, Nintendo took a series that was feeling stale and managed to completely reinvigorate it. Gone were the traditional items and equipment and the dungeons of the temples. In their stead were a handful of brilliantly designed abilities and a physics playground for the ages. Breath of the Wild not only innovated for the Zelda series, but for the open world genre. I love that Breath of the Wild sold as many units as it did. I couldn't be more pleased that it climbed to the 4th best-selling Nintendo Switch title. Why, though, is Tears of the Kingdom lagging behind so much? I'm not seriously disappointed because 18.5 million units sold is still a phenomenal accomplishment. I can tell you from experience that Tears of the Kingdom plays differently than Breath of the Wild. I can tell you that the adventure feels fresh and exciting, and that the story is even more compelling than in Breath of the Wild. However, when it comes to the sales, there are two problems that we've already seen with Majora's Mask, as well as other games in other series. One is that because Tears of the Kingdom is a direct sequel, there will be a group of gamers who don't play it until they've experienced Breath of the Wild. The other problem is that the differences between the two games are not apparent enough to the casual eye. One final point that I have to mention is that Nintendo raised the price of the game by $10. Is that enough of a reason for any Zelda fan to not purchase the game? Maybe not on its own, but it certainly doesn't help any potential buyers. Here are the figures for every major Zelda title. This chart lumps together the data from remakes and remasters under a singular title. Right away, you'll see that it was silly of me to exclude Link's Awakening from the previous graph. Link's Awakening, in large part due to the Switch remake, has earned a pretty penny for Nintendo. Skyward Sword also benefited from a Switch release, but the most surprising sales to me are those of the handheld games. The DS sequels to the Wind Waker combined to sell 7.7 million units. Ocarina of Time 3D, Majora's Mask 3D, and A Link Between Worlds combined to sell a whopping 14.2 million units on the 3DS. That number rises to 15.5 million units if you include Triforce Heroes. There isn't anything new to glean from this graph that relates to the topic at hand, so let's move on to some other points to consider for a series success. Do you recall me mentioning player demographics earlier in the video? I was curious about the correlations between aging player bases and the decline in popularity of any given series. Unfortunately, that information is either closely guarded or not collected. I did find some websites reporting on demographics, but their sample sizes were tiny. The best thing that I can show you is this graphic from Nintendo in 2022. What you see here is the age distribution of 106 million annual playing users. That term describes users with Nintendo accounts who launched a Switch game between October of 2021 and September of 2022. It is important to note that many consoles with multiple users will only have a single registered user. That's the case in my family, where my brother has a profile, but not a registered account. I imagine that many parents do not register accounts for their young children either, which might explain why there are relatively few children in the graph and a surprisingly high number of people in their 30s and early 40s. When I see the bulk of Nintendo's gamers being in their 20s, I imagine a generation that didn't grow up with Ocarina of Time, Final Fantasy VII, or the earliest Pokémon games. I'm not sure how missing out on those games might impact their taste or their spending habits. I suppose it would be easy for them to recognize innovative games, since they presumably grew up during periods of mediocrity for many of the longest running series. The latest, greatest, and sometimes the most innovative titles released within the last 5 years. It feels like we're currently in the middle of another golden era of gaming, and most gamers appear old enough to be able to appreciate that. While we are getting good games for wide audiences, I also see many developers purposefully creating games that they think will appeal to people in their teens and early 20s, or more specifically, games that will blow up on streaming sites. You have to wonder about the design processes behind some of those games. Are they thinking, should my game follow that latest trend? Will my game be fun to watch if someone else is streaming it? Should my game have microtransactions? Should the loot systems reward playtime instead of skill? Or maybe feats achieved in skill-based games will get us more publicity. These are all legitimate business questions in the social media era that we live in today. You might not enjoy hearing them if you're a gaming purist who only wants developers to make good and fun games, but rest assured, there are still many passionate developers out there. They're not all out to make a quick cash grab. Generally speaking, I think that Replication is the more popular choice for developers, especially the ones that I just imitated. Although, for them and many companies starting out, it's not just replication, but pure imitation. This isn't a new phenomenon, and the concept isn't exclusive to gaming. Different companies have been copying each other's most popular games and series forever. Here's an example, even if you're not familiar with gaming history. Consider the fact that we have genres and subgenres named after other games, Metroidvanias, Souls-likes, Zelda clones, etc. In order to differentiate yourself from everyone else chasing the same trend, you have to at least put your own spin on the game. Minecraft popularized both crafting and voxel graphics. That's what it's called when games use a bunch of tiny cubes for their graphics. PC gaming, for almost the entirety of the 2010s, felt like it had been reduced to survival crafting games, MOBAs, and Minecraft clones. You can probably come up with examples for all three genres that I listed, but take a moment to really consider what the most popular Minecraft clone was. I'll give you 5 seconds. And if you thought of Terraria, congratulations. I don't mean to disparage Terraria or Relogic, its developer, by calling it a Minecraft clone. Terraria is significantly different from Minecraft, as was intended. Yes, it was inspired by the game, and it was released in the wake of Minecraft's earliest popularity, but the game is certainly innovative. So innovative, in fact, that we've had numerous Terraria clones after it. Being a copycat is just fine. I have no real problem with it. You'll be criticized for lacking originality, which is totally deserved, but if you manage to put out a decent game, then you'll attain some small measure of success. However, if you can manage it, then innovation is the key ingredient that will propel you towards greater success. Well, assuming that the market isn't fickle. Just because you innovate and have a good game doesn't mean it's going to be popular, but it sure helps. Let's briefly criticize those sitting on the other side of the aisle, the fans. How many fans even want something different in their favorite series? This too is not something exclusive to gaming. You see the same discussions taking place across all other forms of media, especially movies. Typically, the fans want the same, but different. What does that mean? How is that possible? It might mean that they want the same characters, usually the same gameplay, or maybe the same setting. Any deviation too far feels like alienation. So, what is a developer to do when fans make the most confusing demand possible? How can developers make the same game that's only different enough? How can developers make a different game that still feels the same? Well, start by realizing what made you successful in the first place. Understand the risks involved with deviating from your established norm. Prepare for the risks involved should you not succeed to the degree in which you had hoped. I believe, like with so many other creative endeavors, that if you make what you know is good, and a lot goes into knowing, then it should be successful. I was going to include a section about remakes and remasters and discuss how companies could theoretically use remasters, which are literally replications, to turn quick profits. My hope was that my research would show these companies putting the money towards their bigger, more ambitious, and innovative games. Imagine a situation, which is purely hypothetical, like Nintendo using the profits generated by Link's Awakening for the Switch to fund the next groundbreaking Zelda title. I wanted to dig for instances of proof like that. Unfortunately, it's yet another research topic without much public information, and I'm pressed for time, so I'll have to revisit the idea in another video. After all of this discussion, are we any closer to knowing for certain whether innovation or replication leads to success? I almost feel like by homing in on this one particular issue, I was missing the bigger picture about what made games successful. I don't mean things like gameplay and the stories, because those could fall under the scope of this replication versus innovation analysis. I mean that this scope may have simply been too narrow to answer questions about something as complex as success. Looking at the sales charts was fun. However, we saw so many other external factors at play during the course of our review. The health of a console, localization efforts, the extent of advertising campaigns, etc. I would need significantly more time and significantly more information to parse everything out, and then to make specific and measured determinations about how much each element contributes to success. Of course, at that point, I'd be pretending to be a marketing research analyst without the help of professional AI tools, so forget it. Another idea that I didn't get to explore was that some games and series simply get too big to fail. Of course, there are exceptions to everything, like Square Enix signing that timed exclusivity contract with Sony and burying Final Fantasy XVI, but only for the time being. As soon as that contract expires and the game becomes available elsewhere, it's going to at least triple in popularity. If a company without the name brand recognition did the same thing, it would probably be the end of them. If you want to look at movies and television, look at Disney and their handling of Marvel, or just Disney as a whole. It's taken dozens of consecutive, grossly inferior products to sink their ship. Nobody else could dream of having as many chances as they had. Let's recap our results before saying goodbye. It seems like the Pokémon series is as successful as it is because they've replicated the addicting core mechanics of their mainline games in every iteration. Catching sometimes has a few tweaks, and battling has been improved with Pokémon abilities, but that's about it. The Final Fantasy series has thrived and plummeted, but never too far, with its innovation. I feel like much of their financial success is due to their insistence on spamming the market with countless re-releases. The Zelda series is another example of consistency and replication paying off, but we all witnessed what happened with Breath of the Wild. When Nintendo finally decides that it's time to truly innovate and that no expenses should be spared, we are gifted with the best games of all time. Thank you everybody for watching, and thank you especially to anybody who watched the whole video through. I hope that you had fun. I hope that you learned something. I hope that I could entertain you or educate you or anything. Whatever it is that you learned and whatever it is that you want to contribute, please take to the comments. I'd be interested in reading it, whether it's long or short. And I want to hear some examples from you guys. What are some examples of series that have benefited from innovation? What are some examples of series that have unfortunately declined because of stagnation? And you know, I thought that that would be the case with Call of Duty when I was younger, but apparently I was wrong. Anyways, thank you once again. Goodbye everybody. I will see you in the next video.